Hi there, my name is Sarah, and today we're going to be learning all about REST APIs. Now, if you're totally new to the idea of REST APIs, you might find the concept a little bit overwhelming. Maybe you're not completely sure how to get started, or maybe you're not quite sure how to even start getting started. If any of that sounds familiar, then good news, you're not alone. In this video, I'm going to talk about some common API-related terms, and we'll get a general overview of how APIs can be used to transmit data online. In the second half, we're actually going to practice using a real API to send and receive data to and from a remote internet server. There's going to be no programming necessary, so if you don't write code, that's totally fine. You'll still be able to follow along. By the end of the video, you should be a little more equipped to begin learning about and using other APIs, including APIs like the ones we use here at Planet in real-world situations. So first things first, let's demystify some of the jargon that you'll likely encounter when talking about or working with web APIs. First of all, an API, which stands for Application Programming Interface, what that means is it defines a way of communicating between software and applications. REST stands for Representational State Transfer, and it's basically an architectural style of creating web services that communicate with web resources. Now don't worry, if those definitions both seem pretty opaque, it's completely fine. For the most part, these are really broad concepts that software developers use to inform the work they do. As an API user, as long as you have some general familiarity with the terms, you're good to go. Also, a quick note about names. When we're talking about web services that allow us to access data and resources over the web, you'll commonly hear people say REST or RESTful API. In many cases, you may also hear API used to refer to a REST API. You might have noticed here in this video, I'm also using the phrase Web API interchangeably with API or REST API. Basically, anything of the above is acceptable as long as you understand that it's all referring to the context of working with data services over the web. Now, before we continue learning about web APIs, I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, what happens if I type www.planet.com in my browser? In order to better understand how communication over the web works, let's break down what actually is going on behind the scenes when you access a website like planet.com in your browser. So when you enter a URL, that URL is translated into an IP address, which is a unique address representing a destination somewhere on the internet. Your browser is then going to make a request against that unique address for more information. Once your browser knows the destination for its URL, it can make a request against an IP, and when that request is made, if all goes well, a server located at that IP address will respond to the request. And finally, your browser is going to render whatever response it receives back. It's going to attempt to put anything it receives back in your browser window, displaying images, drawing clickable buttons, setting font sizes, colors, and so on. And then if all goes well, you'll get a website back. It'll render in your browser and you'll be able to view the result. Now I want to talk a little bit about requests and responses. When we communicate over the web, HTTP, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol, is the language that clients like our web browser use to communicate with web servers. HTTP defines a standardized way of communicating information through a series of requests and responses. A client can make a request using HTTP to a server, and then that server in return can send a response back to the client. Both requests and responses have two parts, a header and optionally a body. Request headers allow the client to send information about that request to the server. And similarly, response headers contain information about the response. We'll learn more about what kind of information and meta information headers can contain later in the video when we go hands-on with that API usage. In both requests and responses, the body will contain actual data being transmitted. So let's say, for example, you're using a weather API, and that API might return the current temperature at a given location. That temperature data will be returned in a response body. In REST APIs, every single request that is made has an HTTP method associated with it. An HTTP method is used to signal the type of action that the request wishes to perform. The most common HTTP methods include GET. A GET request is just asking to receive a copy of a resource. POST. A POST request can send data to a server in order to create a new resource. PUT. A PUT request will send data to a server in order to modify an existing resource. And delete. which, as you might imagine, sends data to a server in order to delete a resource. Now, in working with REST APIs, we're often going to talk about requests by their method type. For example, we might say the sentence, make a GET request, or post to that API. Both of these sentences are just ways of referring to interactions with an API. HTTP responses don't have methods, but they do have status codes. HTTP status codes are included in the header of every single response in a REST API. Status codes include information about the result of the request. If all goes well, for example, the 200 OK status is returned. You might be familiar with some of the more common HTTP status codes that are used in addition to 200, such as 404, which means the requested resource was not found, 401, which means the client that made the request was not authorized to make that request, or 500, which means something went wrong while the server was trying to process that request. And finally, let's talk a bit about URLs. In APIs, resources are located at URLs, which stands for Uniform Resource Locator. URLs can include something called paths. In this example, path/to/resource indicates the resource's location. For example, maybe it's in a directory on the remote server's file system. URLs can also include what we call query strings. In this example, the question mark at the end of the path indicates the beginning of a so-called query string. Everything following the question mark is the query string. In this case, the query string is name equals cat and color equals black. Query strings let you query a resource based on some metadata fields, for example, name and color here, and values that might be found in those fields, for example, cat and black here. All right, I know we've covered a whole lot of things here, so before we move on, I want to take just a minute and review. So far, we've learned what REST, RESTful, and API means, and at least we've become a little bit more familiar with those terms so that we can recognize them when we hear them again. We've also learned a little bit about what happens when you enter a URL in your browser and hit enter. We've touched on requests and responses and learned that every request and response has a header, and optionally, every request and response may also have a body. We've talked about request methods and some of the common methods you might see like GET or POST. And we've talked about response codes and some of the most common codes you might see, for example, 200 OK or 404 not found. We briefly mentioned URLs and some URL structures and what sorts of things you might encounter, including a query string. Now next up, we're going to take some time and go hands-on with an API called the CAT API. This is a real API for learning and experimenting. So let's take a break, get a drink of water, have a stretch, and we'll be right back here in a moment. All right, welcome back. Well, now we're going to learn a little bit about one of my favorite APIs to learn with, called the CAT API. So if you want to follow along, go ahead and open up a new browser window and navigate to thecatapi.com. Now this is a website built for learning about APIs. This is not affiliated with Planet. I just really like it personally for learning APIs. So the CAT API, as you can see here, says Cats as a Service. It's a public service API all about cats. It's free to use when you're making an app or a website if you just need a test API. Now when you load the catapi.com, it might look a little bit different because this picture randomly changes every time you load it. So let's go ahead and navigate to the docs up here on the navigation bar. And this is going to tell us a little bit about how to use the CAT API as a developer. So you can see that this API lets you do a lot of things, including searching images, getting info about images or about cat breeds, or filtering searches, voting for images, setting images as your favorites, using custom values for users, which is a little bit more complex than we'll get into today. You can even add your own images to the API, and you can get some machine learning analysis results, which sounds pretty cool. But the very first thing we want to do to learn how to use an API is just get an image. So let's look at their quick start. So they say, using the language or framework of your choice, load this URL. It's going to give you an array of objects in a JSON response with a URL in it. Well, that seems pretty simple. We're not completely sure how that works, but let's test it out. So let's copy this URL. Let's move our browser. And this is just a command line. So go ahead if you want to open up your own command line right now. I'm going to use a tool called curl, and it's spelled C-U-R-L. Now curl is available for basically anybody on a computer right now. So if you're running Windows, you probably have curl. If you're running a Mac or Linux machine, you've probably got curl available. Now the way to check if you have curl is open up your command line or your terminal or command prompt, whatever you call it, type curl and type -- help and hit enter. Now if you do have curl installed, it's going to have all of this text scroll past, which is basically telling you how to use curl. So a little bit about what is curl when I'm talking about curl. Curl is just a tool that lets you interact with web APIs from your command line. It's a really simple way of making requests against an API and viewing responses. So we're going to use curl to make some requests against the cat API. So if you recall, we saw that to make an image request, there was a quick start URL and it said to just load this URL. We're going to assume when they say load the URL that they mean to do a GET request. By default, if a method is not specified, it usually means you're going to do a GET request. So let me clear this help so that it's cleaner. So to use curl to make a request, we're going to type curl, and we're going to paste the URL in that we want to make a request to. We hit enter. And that's it. We made a request against an API. So what happened? Well, it looks like we got back a blob of text, and this text looks like it's formatted in an interesting way. And in fact, this is JSON text. So you can see JSON if you're familiar with it. We've got square brackets, curly braces, and then keys and values that are separated by commas. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of what JSON is and how it works in this video, but if you'd like to learn more, there will be some additional help in the description. So we'd made a request against this API and we got a URL. Let's do that again. Let's do the same request, just hit enter and run it again. Now I notice when I ran this twice in a row, I get two different results. So things that are different include this ID in the first one and the second one, as well as this URL, because it uses the ID and the file name, and the width and height of these images. So it looks like every time you make a request against this URL, you're probably getting a random image back. So let's copy one of these images and just see what it looks like. So we'll go back to our browser. It has the cat API documentation. We'll paste that URL in, and we'll take a look at our random cat. And there we go. That is the second result we got from our API. Let's move this over to the side. Move this over here. And let's paste that other URL in just to take a look at it. Well, there we go. Two different cats. That's pretty cool. But so far, not too much interesting has happened. We have learned that we can use curl with a URL to make a GET request. But I want to use curl to show a little bit more of what's going on here. So let's do a curl-v with the same URL. And what the -v does is tells us that we want a more verbose response. So include more information in your curl response. So what this is going to do is give us more information and show more of what's going on behind the scenes when we're making a request against a server and receiving a response. Alright, so a lot more has happened here. Let me scroll up a little bit so we can see the very beginning. So now that we've got that verbose response, we can actually see lots of what's going on. So first things first, we notice that that URL we typed in, api.thecatapi.com, etc., got translated into an IP address. So that translation step is just like we talked about what happens when you type a URL in your browser. This time curl is doing that for us. So we've got an IP address that we're attempting to connect to, and it looks like we successfully connected to it. So that's great. Obviously we know that happened because we do get a cat picture back. So we were able to connect, and this follows a bunch of connection details about the different security information with the connection, and so on and so forth. So all the way down to here is about the connection. Now here you can see that it also tells us what version of HTTP it speaks, the server, so that we can confirm, we can speak that back to them. We do a lot of what's called handshaking, which is just making sure our client can communicate with that server. And then we give them a little bit of information about us. We say we're using curl, and they say, yes, we're cool, we can do that. All right, so all of this part up here is negotiating the connection. All of that happens almost instantaneously. Now, after the connection is negotiated, we get a response back. So we've sent our request, our connection was successful, and we get a response back. So this section here, I'm going to highlight it. This is the response header. So it tells us, first of all, the status code is 200. Now, if you recall, 200 means okay, so everything went well. It tells us the date and time that the response is made. So it's Friday, the 29th of May right now, and in UTC, or Greenwich Mean Time, it is 5:36. Tells us that the content type of the response we're getting is JSON, which, like we said, we noticed. It gives us a character set, so if there's different character sets in use, for example, for different alphabets, it would put that here. It tells us exactly how many characters we got back, so that's 103 characters. It even tells us details about the server that was making the response. It's a piece of software called Nginx, and it gives us the version. Now, it gives us some more information. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but this is all additional metadata about the response that we received. Now, very last thing we've got here, I'm going to highlight it. This is the response body. So all of that, negotiating the connection, passing our headers, getting response headers back, all of that leads up to the actual useful information we wanted, which is contained in the response body. And this is that piece of JSON that's 103 characters long that included the URL to a cat. And you notice we ran it again, we got a new URL, so of course it's required that we take a look at this cat. It's a cat in a box. So you see when you do curl with the -v, what it does is show us all of that negotiation of connection and request header and response header. And if you don't do the V, it just leaves all that undisplayed and you only see the response body. So it really depends on what you're interested in seeing. So let's step back a minute and think about what we've done. We've learned how to use a tool called curl, and we've used it to make requests against an API. At this point, we've actually made multiple requests. So give yourself a round of applause. You have made requests against an API. Congratulations. So that's it for our intro to APIs right now. If you'd like to continue learning more, you can check out the Planet School website and find our complete REST APIs tutorial that you can follow along at your own pace. Good luck and happy learning.